To be mindful of everyone's time, I believe we should start. Hopefully we'll have other people joining soon. To those of you on right now, I would like to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Catherine Adames, Director of Interpreting Operations at Effective. With me today, the wonderful Lisa, who is our ASL interpreter. As stated on the screen, we will be reviewing on our webinar about accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing people through interpreting services and other resources. Approximately 15% of American adults have reported some level of hearing loss. Among this group, we have about 2 million individuals who are deaf and they lost their hearing after learning spoken language. Many of these people need an interpreter or other type of communication aid or service to be able to communicate effectively. Communication aids and services are ways to ensure that communication with a person who has a hearing disability is effective. Now, what is accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing individuals? Accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing must be thought of very deeply, covering their community, respecting their culture and individuality. Assistive technologies is a term used to refer to accessibility tools that make everyday life easier for people with disabilities. The goal of accessibility for the deaf is to promote more autonomy and freedom so that they can be included in our society in a fair and equal way. For example, to make sure that accessibility for deaf people are able to watch videos, it is necessary to include subtitles and also, if you may, a sign language interpreter so that they can receive the information that is being transmitted in audio. Only counting on subtitles does not make the video 100% accessible because it is necessary to consider the diversity within the deaf community itself, since not all people who are part of it prefer to use ASL. In the same way, some of them do not communicate in American Sign Language or ASL, and rather using subtitles. Let's talk about the law, why it is important that we allow the deaf and hard of hearing to have access to all services. I am sure you guys have already heard about the Americans with Disability Act, also called ADA, which was established in 1990, and it prevents discrimination based on abilities or disability. Its goal is to ensure that disabled people can have access to the same rights and services as anyone else. Under the ADA, or Americans with Disability Act, people who are deaf or hard of hearing are entitled to the same services provided to anyone. They may not be excluded or segregated from services. They cannot be denied services or otherwise be treated differently than other people. Specifically applied to public venues, the ADA requires buildings and services to be accessible to people with disability. If your industry is mentioned here, then you should be interested in reading about the ADA. If you own a shop or a shopping mall, hotels, bars, restaurants, hospitals, banks, colleges and universities, public services such as utilities or city halls, amusement parks, places of worship, sporting facilities like stadiums, cultural places such as museums and movie theaters. Now, how important is accessibility for deaf signers? First, let's say that signers are deaf or hard of hearing people who communicate through sign language, like we're seeing on our screen right now. Many of them have great difficulty with written languages, and therefore, communication in American Sign Language provides freedom and autonomy in their daily lives. With accessibility in ASL, they can receive in their mother language all of the information that is being transmitted in English. This is essential to ensure their inclusion in society, in schools, universities, and in the labor market, in your client list, and in other environments. Without accessibility for deaf signers, these people will struggle tremendously to perform important functions of daily life, such as participating in business meetings, shopping on the internet, following important news, and even studying. So let's talk about accessibility resources that we may have to implement in our venues or services in order to provide these for the deaf and hard of hearing. Deaf and hard of hearing people are not all the same. This part is very important and do not always communicate in the same way. In my experience, we would need at the time of arranging an assignment for ASL, explain to our customers that there are different types of people with this need. Therefore, their culture is very broad. As I said before, they do not communicate in the same way or in the same language. For example, other than deaf signers, there are also the ones that are oral deaf. These are people who are literate in English and can lip read and prefer to speak as mentioned before. Therefore, it is important to take this into consideration when we are thinking about accessibility resources for them. In order to provide accessible services for the deaf and hard of hearing, we should implement a communication access plan for the non-spoken language. We're going to describe a few steps here on. This communication access plan can spell out how organizations will train their staff on its policies and procedures for providing auxiliary aids and services or reasonable accommodations for people who cannot hear or have problems with hearing, including which staff members will be trained and how often these trainings will take place. Staff training is important not only so that people feel supported throughout their experience at any facility or venue, but also so that those working at the organization understand how to best support with varying levels of hearing, the people with varying language levels of hearing, including those who obviously have a hearing loss and those who have a hidden disability. In a communication access plan, we have 4 points. The first one is assessing the need. The second part is provisions or types of services that we may offer, followed by training, and lastly, evaluation. Let's describe the needs of assessment. In order to determine how they may best provide effective communication for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, our organizations can start by identifying the number of people they currently serve who are deaf or hard of hearing, as well as how many they're likely to serve. People who are deaf or hard of hearing have varying degrees of residual hearing. This variation, as well as the variation in the types of assistive devices people use, can affect the types of aids, services, and accommodations that are most likely effective, that we should effectively issue or ensure for them. As an example, what an organization will need to do to provide effective communication with an individual who uses sign language, like Lisa right now, can be different than what it will be needed to provide effective communication with an individual who does not use sign language. When we're talking about the provisions and types of available services, this is the second section of the organization's communication access plan, and it will typically consider individuals, the various needs, while identifying what services it will provide to meet those needs in both the out consumer and the in consumer settings. This section typically includes details about what is available, as well as when and how auxiliary and aid services or reasonable accommodations will be provided. This section of a communication access plan may also include information about how and where the organization will notify the people it serves about the availability of services. Organizations can consider including information about the availability of services in a range of accessible formats at the same points of contacts that are identified during the needs of assessment. The points of contacts could be call centers, reception desks, office. If we're in a hospital scenario, we're going to consider also the visits that the deaf and hard of hearings are going to be in. Part of the services that may be available for the deaf and hard of hearings are the subtitles in videos for the people in need. To start, let's say that subtitles were introduced in the 1930s when silent film transitioned to talkies or films with spoken audio to accommodate foreign audiences who didn't understand the language used in the film. Subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing assume the end user cannot hear the dialogue and include important non-dialogue information such as sound effects, music, and speaker identification. SDH, or subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, were originally designed for viewers who cannot understand the language, but are increasingly used in a place of captions on some video platforms and services. Forced narratives, or what is known as FN subtitles, also, like I said, also known as forced subtitles, clarify pertinent information meant to be understood by the viewer. FN subtitles are overlaid text used to clarify the dialogue, burned in text graphics, and other information that is not otherwise explained or easily understood by the viewer. The sign language interpreter that you're all able to see on your screen now, Lisa, for example, the role of Lisa is to strictly communicate everything that is being said. So the interpreters sign everything that is said and say everything that is signed. Sign language interpreters must abide by a set of ethical principles established by the National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID. I see some people here say they cannot see Lisa. Allow me 1 second. You still cannot see Lisa on your screen? Allow me 1 second. Okay. Let's see here. Can you guys see Lisa on the screen now? Great, great. I am told that you guys are able to see her. That's fantastic. So Lisa is our sign language interpreter. She has been on since the beginning of this webinar, and we want to thank her for her assistance today. So like I was saying, the sign language interpreters must abide by a set uh, rules or principles that are established by the National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID. The Professional Code of Conduct protects and guides interpreters and those who use their services. Interpreters must be qualified to interpret what is spoken by the hearing person like myself and what is signed by the deaf person. Many interpreters have certifications that ensure their qualifications. Within the field of professional sign language interpreters, there are a number of specialized interpreters that have been used in courts nationwide and other very specific scenarios worldwide. These interpreters are first certified to do general interpreting, and then they take specialized training and testing to prove their abilities in specialty area. We have the certified deaf interpreter, or the CDI, which is the most commonly used specialist interpreter and has a wide range of abilities. We will explain further. The deaf blind interpreter provides interpretation in various modes to people who are deaf and have limited vision. Then we have the trilingual interpreters who provide interpretation between English, ASL, and another spoken language. We also have the oral transliterators who provide communication access in a way that is easily accessible to those people who do not know sign language and depend on speech reading. Let's discuss the CDI, or the Certified Deaf Interpreter. This is an interpreter who has been certified by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID, and is proficient in recognizing those ASL constructs that are appropriate to use in many cases, precisely because the CDI lives in an environment without meaningful access to sound. Their world is organized visually. CDIs have specialized training and or experience in the use of gestures, props, drawing, and other tools to enhance communications. CDIs must work in partnership with an American Sign Language interpreter who can hear and are subject to the same rules and oaths of all other interpreters. In this deaf hearing interpretation team, the hearing ASL interpreter interprets from spoken English into sign language that is directed to the CDI, and then the CDI interprets the ASL message linguistically and culturally in the language or communication mode most understood by the deaf user. Working with a deaf hearing interpreting team requires the strict use of consecutive mode in all situations. This means that the ASL interpreter begins interpreting into ASL only after the English speaker has completed their speech. Once the interpretation is completed, the CDI then begins interpreting for the deaf person using a variety of visual and gestures communication techniques. The process will be repeated in reverse when the deaf person is the source of the message to be interpreted. Therefore, simultaneous interpretation, like we're doing right now with Lisa, is not the most viable in this context. Let's talk about the trilingual interpreter. So the trilingual interpreter is an interpreter who facilitates communications among three different languages. In the deaf and hard of hearing community, this is generally defined as working between American Sign Language, English, and an additional spoken language. Very famously these days, we've seen American Sign Language, English, and Spanish in our requests. Trilingual interpreters work in situations that involve an English speaker, a speaker of another language like Spanish, and an ASL user, but may also be needed in a situation where deaf or hard of hearing people use American Sign Language, but they're accustomed to speech reading, spoken language, or reads written Spanish, for example. I would like to confirm before I move on that you guys are able to see Lisa on the screen. You can write your responses on the Q&A. You can't. Okay. That's 1 second, please. Can you guys see Lisa? Are you guys able to see Lisa now? Yes, great. All right. My apologies for that. Thank you all. So trilingual interpreters work in situations that involve an English speaker, a speaker of another language like Spanish, like I said before, and an ASL user, but may also be needed in situations where deaf or hard of hearing people are used to American Sign Language, but feel more comfortable with speech reading, spoken Spanish or other languages, or reads written Spanish or other languages. Trilingual interpreters must have language fluency and cultural competence in all three languages in order to effectively and accurately maintain message equivalency in the interpretation. The Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf does not currently have a certification specific for this type of interpreting, but one of the states that has a certification is the Texas Department of Health. Now let's talk about the deaf blind specialist interpreter. The amount and type of vision and hearing loss a person has determines the type of interpreting that will be most effective for that individual. An experienced and certified deaf blind interpreter can assess the appropriate method and position required to accommodate the user. An example of an accommodation is on the screen towards the right, where the consumer is right in front of the deaf-blind interpreter, and then we also have the provider. Two common types of deaf-blind interpreting. First one is the closed visual range, in which the interpreter and the deaf-blind consumer, as on the screen, are positioned very close to one another and often provided with additional lighting. We also have the tactile sign language. In this one, the sign language is received by the sense of touch with one or two hands. Deaf-blind interpreting is physically and mentally demanding and will require a team of interpreters unless the event is under 1 hour, in which case one interpreter may be sufficient. We also have the oral transliteration. An oral transliterator provides communication access to a person who is deaf or hard of hearing and who uses speech reading and speaking as a means of communicating. The oral transliterator, positioned in front of the deaf person, inaudibly repeats the spoken message for people who are deaf, making the speech as readable as possible. This is called expressive oral transliterate. An oral transliterator also can audibly voice the spoken message of a deaf person to the hearing audience. This is called voicing or voiceover. Why are or when are oral transliterators used? We can have a variety of scenarios. One could be an educational setting, religion services and ceremonies, job interviews, medical and legal settings, in employment, conferences, and workshops. And also, we see it very commonly in town hall meetings. The list goes on as access is now more common for people with deaf and hard of hearing. Um, the transliterators are especially helpful when there are multiple speakers. The speech reader cannot see the speaker clearly, and when the speaker is not speech readable, such as the speaker with facial hair or something covering their lips or faces. Something that we are very commonly now hearing are captioning. Captioning is the process of converting the audio content of a television broadcast, webcast, film, video, CDR-ROM, DVD, live event, or other productions into text and displaying the text on a screen, monitor, or any other visual display system. Captions not only display words, they also include speaker identification, sound effects, and music description. It is important that one, captions are synchronized and appear at approximately the same time as the audio is being delivered. Two, that they're equivalent and equal in content to that of the audio, including speaker identification and sound effects. And three, it is accessible and the people are able to read it for those who are in need. Captions must have sufficient size and contrast to ensure that they're able to be read and that they're timely, accurate, complete, and efficient. Captioning makes audio and audiovisual material accessible and provides a critical link to communication, information, education, news, and entertainment for people in the deaf and hard of hearing community. Now, moving on to the third part of the communication access plan, which is training. For everything, training is important. And not only so that people feel supported throughout their experience at a healthcare facility, for example, but also so that those working at the organization understand how to best support people with varying levels of hearing, including those with obvious hearing loss and those with a hidden disability. Additionally, staff training can help ensure that all consumers are respected and provided with the required support and services necessary for effective communication. Staff training can contribute to goals such as providing education about how to communicate effectively with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And it could be incorporated in federal disability laws and their requirements into the new employee training. This is very common and it's what we're seeing in our experience, and can ensure that all employees receive training on deaf culture and ASL as a language different than English. adopting a standard method to document whether a consumer is deaf or hard of hearing, whether they have communication needs, and the preferred mode of communicating for each consumer. It could be part of documenting in a standard manner the request for the presence of an interpreter during a medical visit, an appointment, a court hearing, or any other um, accommodation for a venue or service. And also, when we ask a consumer if they need or don't need an interpreter, they will be able to decline or refuse the service. As appropriate, identifying deaf consumers as needing an interpreter when referred to for further testing or care. Developing benchmarks for access to high quality care for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. The last part of our language access plan or communication access plan, is the evaluation. Um, so typically, this includes information on monitoring and continuous quality improvement. Some ways an organization can collect and monitor data for continuous quality improvement. First, monitoring the organization's responses to complaints or suggestion by people who are deaf or hard of hearing, assessing the organization's communication services to monitor quality, monitoring the organization's response to complaint regarding interpretation assistance, keeping track of which auxiliary aids and services are used throughout the organization and under what circumstances, tracking how often the auxiliary aids and services are provided, when they're requested, regardless of the need, or when they are needed. Talking to staff across the organizations about the use of auxiliary aids and services or reasonable accommodations, suggestions for improvement, and whether these services meet the consumer's needs. It is also appreciated when staff members collect feedback from consumers who are deaf or hard of hearing to better understand their experience accessing healthcare or communication of services at the organization. And lastly, using the information collected through each of the steps to continuously monitor and update the organization efforts towards providing high quality care for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Here are some tips for when we're working with sign language interpreters. Like we did today before this event, we shared our notes and the outlines, handouts, and uncaptioned movies if necessary with the interpreters in advance. We will also share the speakers' names, the acronyms, and the specialized terminology that will be used. We will position the interpreter. We felt at first, but now we have it very well for you all to see. The interpreter near the speaker, provided for the seating or deaf and hard of hearing. And in this event, we will make sure that the interpreter is spotlighted for everyone to see. We would always provide appropriate lighting for the interpreter. If you plan to turn down the lights during the assignment, remember to leave enough light for the interpreter. We must, and this for me and Lisa as interpreters, we must treat the interpreters as professionals. The interpreter is not a personal assistant for the deaf individual and should only be asked to facilitate communication. Look and speak directly to the deaf or hard of hearing individual. Look at the person who is deaf or hard of hearing when signing or speaking to them through an interpreter. Do not speak to the interpreter directly. This may feel awkward at first, but then you'll get used to it and it's more comfortable for the interpreter and the consumer. Like I said, we should address the deaf and hard of hearing person directly. Appropriate use will be, what is your name? Instead of saying, ask her for her name. Sign or speak at the normal tone or pace. The interpreter will tell you if they need to pause or slow down. In addition, give the interpreter time to finish so that the deaf or hard of hearing person can ask questions or join you in a discussion. Allow only one person to speak at a time during group discussions. It is very difficult for an interpreter to follow several people speaking at once. Ask for a brief pause between speakers to permit the interpreter to finish before the next speaker starts. It can be helpful to ask people to raise their hands and wait to speak after they have been recognized. Also, it is appropriate etiquette for effective communication for each participant to state her or his name before speaking so that a deaf, blind individual will know who is talking. And lastly, like we did today, hopefully, relax. And if you're unsure of the appropriate way to proceed in a particular situation, ask. Typically, interpreters are able to answer any doubt that you may have regarding the culture of a deaf or hard of hearing person, and they can also allow you to understand any extra accommodation that the interpreter or the deaf or hard of hearing person will need. To conclude our webinar today, we should say that without appropriate auxiliary aids or services or reasonable accommodation, it can be difficult to communicate effectively with individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. Ultimately, as organizations work to ensure effective communication with all patients or people who come to their venues or call in for services, a communication access plan can facilitate the provisions of communication assistance services and care to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. Lisa and I would like to thank you for joining us today, and we want to open the floor for questions that you may have. In the event that your question cannot be answered during our webinar, we will surely send you a response, or you can always email me to Catherine.a, Catherine with a K, .a @effective.com. We will also email this presentation to all of the attendees of today's webinar. Someone asked to show the first slides. So I'm going back here. Reyes, we would also send you this webinar for you to review, ask questions, inquiries, or anything else that you may need. If there are no questions, it was our pleasure hosting you today. And we want to wish you a great rest of your day, as well as a great weekend coming up. I know it's 2.5 days away, but we're always looking forward to it. Thank you all on behalf of Effective. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Lisa, thank you so much for your time today.